Good evening. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. Heidi Schwartz, and I'll be your host for this event presented by the Office of Alumni Relations, Women in Medicine, and the University of Rochester Women's Network. After over 30 years of practice, I recently retired from an active clinical care in neurology. I've been fortunate to connect with a broad spectrum of individuals in my practice, as well as my role as an educator and a mentor. I've experienced many different practice settings, including academic medicine, private practice, and employed physician, and experienced tremendous change in healthcare delivery over the years. I'm particularly proud of the many medical students and residents that I've mentored over the years, as well as my work locally and nationally in burnout and mindfulness. Reading Dr. Harding's book was both illuminating and validating for me. Before today's webinar begins, I'd like to share a few Zoom webinar tips to those new to the platform. If you would like to view the session with closed captions, click CC on the bottom toolbar and select Turn on Subtitles. If you have a question, please submit them using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. During the presentation, Dr. Harding will be asking a few questions, in which case we'd like you to use the chat feature for that. And before I introduce our speaker and moderator, I wanted to share a little bit more with you about the university's Global Women's Network and Women in Medicine and how this event came to be. This is a milestone year for women. 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, and the 200th birthday of Susan B. Anthony. And the University of Rochester is proud to have 6 women deans, along with the first woman university president, Sarah Mangelsdorf, who together officially launched the Women's Network in an exciting panel discussion on their careers as women in higher education earlier this month. I had the privilege to view this video and found it very inspiring. This new volunteer-led network has a mission to harness and celebrate the rich contributions of women around the globe who are part of the University of Rochester family. Through dynamic programming and engaging conversations, the network will help members connect and support each other in their education and career. Women in Medicine is part of this mission and network to highlight and showcase success, build bridges, and share resources between women in a variety of specialties across the country, and connect alumni with students for mentorship. We will share information at the end of the presentation and in follow-up on both networks. As many of you know, this presentation was originally scheduled for April 2020, but was postponed due to the pandemic. So we're very excited to be gathering virtually today with participants from not only across the country, but around the world, to learn about this very interesting and important area of medicine and how we can apply it to our daily lives and society. Joining me today, we have keynote presenter, Dr. Kelli Harding, an alumna from the University of Rochester Medical School class of 2002, and our student moderator, Jess Hubert, from the University of Rochester Medical School class of 2022. Dr. Harding is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, a board-certified psychiatrist. She is the author of The Rabbit Effect: Live Longer, Healthier, and Happier Lives with the Groundbreaking Science of Kindness. She specializes in the interplay between mental and physical health, and her goal is to care for every patient with a comprehensive, holistic approach. In her work as a physician, writer, and educator, Dr. Harding explores the science of kindness and the social dimensions of health. These hidden factors affect the body in profound ways, altering immune system, metabolism, mental health, and illness. She combines the latest biomedical advances with the big picture public health research to help people live well, even with chronic disease. Jess Hubert is a current medical student, third year, member of the class of 2022. She came to Rochester from completing her undergraduate degree at Oberlin College and is now a leader in a variety of roles in medical education, including the chair of the Medical Society of the State of New York and one of our student ambassadors for our medical students. After Dr. Harding's presentation, Jess Hubert will moderate the question and answer session. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over now to Dr. Harding.
Well, hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much, Dr. Schwartz, for that lovely introduction. I am so grateful to be here and for all of us to be having this conversation. It feels like with everything going on in the world, it's particularly timely. So I'm going to go ahead and just set up my slides real quick. Let me share my screen. All right, 1 second. There we go. All right, everyone. So can everyone see that? Hopefully so. So just to start, I wanted to say that, so today we're going to be talking about the science of kindness, but I just wanted to actually take a second and say how heartwarming it is for me to be talking with all of you and knowing that all of you are out there on this call all over the world, friends, colleagues, fellow alumni. This is really terrific. I wanted to actually share. So I was in the class of 2002 and it feels like just yesterday. This is actually a photo, and I know some of the people in this photo are on the call, some of my classmates. I believe this was our 10-year reunion, actually. And, you know, the book in many ways is a love letter to the University of Rochester. I think had I not had the opportunity to learn medicine there, that I wouldn't have been able to see the things that I saw. And I'm going to tell you that story and share it with you in a minute, but it just feels particularly relevant for all the talks I do to be speaking with all of you today. And that's the book right there. So, so I wrote The Rabbit Effect about kindness and health, which was published in 2019. And my intention was to educate people far outside of medicine about the importance of kindness and the social dimensions of health in our everyday lives. And I just realized before we get started, I wanted to take a second because we know that gratitude is wonderful for health. And just if you could use your chat feature and just go ahead and type in something that you feel grateful for about Rochester. It could be a person, it could be your department, whatever you have in mind. So if we could go ahead and turn on the chat. So probably all of you are seeing this too. Got teams, campus, friends. It looks like some relationships blossom too at the education, the fall, the beauty of the region, the unforgettable experiences, the science, the biopsychosocial model, absolutely. And the arts. This is really wonderful to see all this. And actually, I'm also wondering if on the call you could just, this is so wonderful to see these. Actually, I'm going to give it another minute as they continue to roll in because I see we have a lot of participants. Oh, thank you. I think this is what's so incredible is how the experience at Rochester continues to permeate our lives, you know, sometimes even decades later. And for that, I am so grateful. And to see all these, and even new friends that people are making that are there now. I'm also curious if we could just take a second too and let me know what you studied, and just to get a feel, and for other people to get a feel, if you were in the School of Medicine, if you were in other departments, or if you've gone on to work in public health. Oh, we have extended family too. Wonderful. I'm seeing MDs, music, psychiatrists, public policy, nursing, School of Business, internal medicine. This is great. So we've got a really terrific range. And religion. Okay, wonderful. So, so I'll just go ahead and tell you that one of my goals in our talk today is to actually convince you all that no matter what your major was, no matter what you studied, no matter what you're doing now, that you actually work in public health. So I'll tell you more about that. So we can go ahead. It looks like the chat might have stopped, or we've got a couple more, but in a minute when it slows down, we can go ahead and turn that back off again. But I wanted to let you know, so when I published the book, it was a different world. And it was such a surprise to me how the effects of COVID-19 and everything that's happened in 2020 would amplify the message that was in the book. We know that in the US, the COVID-19 infection rate is 3 times higher in predominantly Black counties than in white counties, and that the mortality rate is 6 times higher. COVID has shown a spotlight on long-standing social inequalities and structural racism. I also had no idea about what would happen in mental health. None of us did. Recent data shows that depression symptoms in the US are up 3 times from pre-pandemic levels. And data in June showed that 1 in 10 US adults contemplated suicide. And we know that medicine is not immune to this either. And of course, the pervasive anxiety from everything that's going on, from the virus to fires to storms to the social justice and also the election. So there's a lot on everyone's plate, on every single person who's on this call. There's one other piece that I want to mention is I also didn't know how my own life would be touched in 2020. I lost my wonderful dad, Bruce, to what we now believe were COVID cardiac complications back in April. I suspect there are people on this call who have also lost friends and family members too. So here we are, we're at this critical point in the world, and I'm glad we're having this conversation because the work that you do in your everyday lives is critical to the health of the world. I'm going to take the next half an hour or so to talk about kindness, the big picture of health, and yes, rabbits. You're probably wondering at this point, what is the deal with those rabbits? So first, a little bit of background about me. So as Dr. Schwartz mentioned, I've spent most of my career clinically at Columbia University Medical Center in New York City, practicing emergency psychiatry. And it's sort of the wild west of the emergency room where anything can happen. I've seen people flip stretchers, rip things out of the ceiling, and dance naked. It's also the intensive care unit for wounds that are invisible to the naked eye. It feels worlds away from our lovely virtual gathering today, but it's exactly that work that led me to kindness. So first, I want to talk about some medical mysteries. So once upon a time, back in, I guess, 1998, I decided that I wanted to go to medical school to help people live healthy lives. And I didn't just go to any medical school. I went to this amazing medical school, the University of Rochester, that's steeped in the biopsychosocial model of medicine. And when I arrived, I set out to learn absolutely everything I could to help my patients. And I have to say, even going to a place like Rochester, I still felt so focused on learning absolutely everything I could about the human body. And every day as a diligent medical student, I hid out in the hospital complex. I sat in silent library cubicles, studying for long hours, or in labs, peering down microscopes. I suspect there are probably some people on this call that are doing those things now. And after a couple of years of intense preparation, I felt ready to take on disease. My superpower was medications in my doctor's bag, I thought. And then one day I got to the wards and I met the patients. And pretty quickly, I saw the mismatch between the elegant textbook explanations of disease and the messy realities of life. And that's when I became aware of the mysteries in earnest. Two patients with the same diagnosis, but two very different courses of illness, or those who defied serious diagnoses and continued to live full lives despite grim prognoses. Or on the flip side, patients with no serious findings on physical exam, blood work, or imaging, yet they felt sick and were not functioning in life. I imagine many of you on the call have seen these things too, whether it's in the hospital or in your own personal life. Initially, I felt confused, so I tried to ignore the mysteries, but it was a pattern that came up again and again. And I imagine it's one that you've seen as well. And it's now that one that we're seeing amplified with COVID. And I kept asking, what are we missing in medicine? And because of that, I thought it had something to do with the mind-body connection. So I trained first actually in internal medicine and then psychiatry. I did a National Institute of Mental Health Research Fellowship in Unexplained Symptoms at Columbia. And I got boarded in consultation liaison medicine or mind-body medicine. And I still didn't feel I really had an answer. Meanwhile, in the emergency room every day, I'd continue to see the mysteries in different forms, patients with vastly different outcomes based on seemingly irrelevant factors such as education level, income, housing, or the color of their skin. Finally, a rabbit came to the rescue. And by the way, this is a rescue rabbit named Zelda, who I met when I was on my book tour, because it's kind of funny where I've never owned a rabbit, but on the tour, a lot of people would show up with rabbits. But anyhow, so one of my dear mentors in my fellowship, Dr. Arthur Barsky at Harvard, told me about a study to check out. So in the late 1970s, researchers were still trying to understand the relationship between diet and heart health. So basic scientist, a lovely man named Dr. Robert Neerum, and his team designed a very straightforward experiment. They gave nearly genetically identical rabbits the same high-fat diet. And at the end of the study, he expected all the measures of health to be the same. And that's when Dr. Neerum had a shock. He found that one group of rabbits had far better health markers than the others. And he recalls wondering, what in the world could this be? There was no clear biological explanation for the findings, and he was staring down his microscope at a medical mystery. And being good researchers, they initially searched for clues within the protocol, but finding nothing, they looked at themselves. And that's when they realized that all the rabbits that had done better were cared for by the same postdoc. She was a particularly kind and caring individual, and they noticed that she wasn't just feeding the rabbits kibble, she was also picking them up. She was petting them, she was talking to them, she was basically giving them love and kindness. So what they did is decided that they couldn't ignore these findings, much to their credit. So they went ahead and repeated the study, this time with really tightly controlled conditions, and they got the exact same outcome, and they published it in the journal Science. It seemed kindness had made all the difference. And much like many medical studies, as many of the people on this call know, there's often this gap between the research and implementation into practice on many levels. So this study was important for me, though, because it got me literally across the street from the medical center at Columbia to the School of Public Health, where I discovered a whole new world. It turned out the rabbits were just the beginning of a much larger story that I've called the rabbit effect. So let's take a second to check up on where we're at with medicine and the health of our nation. So even before coronavirus, the US was lagging far behind on major indicators of health, starting at birth compared to other wealthy nations. This includes measures related to heart disease, obesity, mental illness, homicides, substance use, motor vehicle crashes, maternal mortality, and premature death. And of course, the big elephant in the room is that we spend way more on healthcare than any other developed nation in the world. And yet still 1 in 10 of us don't have health insurance. And with the pandemic, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation projects that by the end of 2020, over 10 million people will lose employee-sponsored health insurance because of it was tied to a job that was lost. So we know that good, affordable medical care is absolutely critical for every human being. But we also know it likely only accounts for about 10 to 20% of somebody's overall health status. And while genes are important, thanks to the emerging field of epigenetics, we now know that they're not as set in stone as we had once thought. Instead, ample data shows that the biggest contributor to our health by far is our everyday social world. And this is where decades of public health research shows how we're treated in our homes, relationships, workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, broader community, and society matters deeply to our health. This is what we call in public health the social determinants, and everyone else calls kindness. So I want to take a second to talk about terminology. I set out to write a book about the social determinants of health. And before 2020, when I talked to people both within and outside of healthcare, I realized that the social determinants didn't always resonate. Many people, including many doctors, thought it was sort of only at the extremes, not something that impacted every single one of us on this call every day of our lives, much like the weather. People in healthcare love their jargon, and I do too. But the problem was that it seemed as though people's eyes were starting to glaze over, and I feared the message wasn't getting in. Meanwhile, kindness is something that every human being understands. And after years of research, I believe it's the essence of the social determinants at every level. What has also been incredibly heartwarming as I've gone around the country talking with general audiences about this is that kindness is something that people from all walks of life, all religions, all political leanings feel that they can stand up for. It's something that everyone can get behind. And we can talk a little bit more about that. I'm just going to take a second to define kindness, though. So the research, it's funny, kindness is one of those things we kind of know it when we see it, but the research definition is actually an act that enhances the welfare of others as an end to itself. So in other words, an act of being considerate, generous, warm in spirit without expecting anything in return. But I don't need to tell you, everyone on this everyone on this call has experienced kindness, and everyone here has offered kindness. So let's take a moment to think about somebody who's supported you in your life. Maybe it was somebody at Rochester that helped you become the person you are, elevated your career, or elevated your life in other ways. So let's just take a second and do that. And if we could go ahead and open back up the chat. So here's the thing. So I mentioned that gratitude is good for health, and actually, it's really amazing for a non-pharmacological intervention how much gratitude can be helpful. There are studies that show it reduces stress hormones, anxiety, depression, increases energy, enthusiasm, improves sleep, diminished inflammatory responses, and it's also associated with fewer illnesses. So let's take a moment to do another gratitude exercise. Go ahead and type the person's name you were thinking about into the chat if you could. Oh gosh, and also seeing the chat is incredibly wonderful. Thank you. Oh, and it's so nice to see so many familiar names too. see Don Bordley, Dr. Morgan. Oh, wow. Actually, Dr. Morgan's come up several times. Wonderful. So, as I am an educator, I also have a little bit of homework assignment for you. So if you wanted to take this an extra step further, I would just recommend reaching out to either the person you thought of or someone connected with them after this call. Send them a text to say, I was thinking of you, I'm grateful for you, or give them a call, or if you can, meet outside and see them, I guess, mask to mask. Or if they're in your home, give them a squeeze too. There's so many people. So hopefully everyone can see the chat there on their screen too. And Morgan and Engel as well, who I'm most grateful to. Wonderful. So in the book, and as I'm telling you this story, I want to let you know that Dr. Engel and Dr. Morgan were ahead of their time in terms of thinking about the biopsychosocial model. And what I found in going through my training, and perhaps some of you have found this as well, is I sort of felt almost like Alice going through the looking glass when I got over to the School of Public Health. It felt like these two worlds between medicine and public health that were looking at the same problems, but from very different perspectives. And so I set out to try to come up with a model that incorporated the language and the philosophy of both. And so that's how I came up with this hidden factors model, which is essentially the social determinants and all these different areas where kindness impacts our lives. And what I'd like to do is actually go through these hidden factors of health and just talk about, now in the book, there's hundreds of examples, and there's even hundreds more since I wrote the book. It feels like the field is exploding as people understand the impact of our social world on our health. But I'm just going to go ahead and talk about a little bit of some of the data. So first, social ties. So that's actually my husband and two of my three boys in Yellowstone National Park. So I just wanted to talk about first. So first, our one-on-one relationships and social ties. And this is obviously particularly tricky in a time of physical distancing. And as you hear some of the things I talk about, I want you to think about it both in your own life and then how you can use these ideas to try to improve things for other people as well. And I have to say, one lovely side effect of all of this is people send me all these creative things that they're doing to try to continue to build relationships and support each other despite the needs for physical distancing right now. So we know that loneliness is as risky to health as well-established health factors such as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, high blood pressure, heavy alcohol use, and even being severely overweight. This is something that even since the time of COVID has gotten much more attention, and thankfully doctors and other people are talking about much more, so that hopefully we can work together to end both social isolation and loneliness. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. So hugs, actually, if you have anybody in your home, it's great to give hugs. They boost the immune system, they boost mood, even a pet, which is important too. There are interesting studies that show that people who got daily hugs were significantly less, by like 32% less likely to get sick. And those who did get sick, being exposed to cold or flu viruses, didn't get as sick. There's also evidence that people with supportive relationships feel less pain for conditions that may come. Obviously, touch is particularly tricky right now, and I'd be curious to hear from the audience too, experiences people have had around this with all our current limitations. There's something else in taking care of people, and this is, I think, quite fascinating. it's not just getting taken care of, the kindness you receive, it's the kindness you give. And it's also the kindness of taking care of others. There are studies that show that people who in nursing homes who were assigned to take care of even something as simple as a plant actually had better health outcomes than people who opted not to do that or weren't assigned. And actually, Atul Gawande writes about that beautifully in one of his books. Okay, so work. This is something that's changed dramatically in 2020, but also remains critical. So our work culture, people say it's important to have a good doctor, but it's also important to have a good manager or supervisor because we spend a lot of our days at work and it has a big impact on our health. Including if that supervisor is you, because I know probably many people are also self-employed on the call. So work culture, we know that things like breaks and naps and siestas appear to boost well-being and actually reduce the risk of heart disease. There's some interesting studies on this. So if you're a leader, you can encourage some of these healthy wellness breaks, including there's data around vacation and how beneficial and breaks, even if you can't go anywhere right now, just taking a little break from work can be helpful, and setting boundaries, which we can talk more about too. There's evidence that people who work in supportive environments take less sick leave, and company healthcare expenses in some studies, mostly from the business world, have shown that healthcare expenses can cost 50% less in supportive environments. There's also evidence that people are happier and more productive. So it's really a win-win to feel valued and cared for as a human being in your workplace. And I also want to mention, for those of you in medicine, this is actually something we don't excel in, and it's something we've got to put a lot more effort into focusing on. One of the big things that I did not know about that really surprised me was the role of education in health. And this is sort of as we continue to move out the layers. So there is evidence that for every one life saved by biomedicine, that education saves 8. So let's think about that for a moment, because I suspect we have some teachers on the call and they might not have realized even that they're basically working in health by the work that they're doing. And the other thing is, what's great about education is it's not just formal schooling, it's also lifelong learning that changes our brains and can potentially improve our health. And this may be closely related to an emerging field of evidence that's quite fascinating around purpose. And I know that many people with COVID have had their sense of purpose challenged to some extent as our world has gotten turned upside down in 2020. So we know that people with a sense of purpose and usefulness are at a significantly reduced risk of all causes of death. They have significantly reduced risks of stroke and heart disease. And there's even evidence that shows that if somebody is living with a disease, they function better. And there was a study that was in the Archives of General Psychiatry that showed that even if a person's brain on autopsy showed a lot of plaques and tangles and sort of evidence that would have contributed to more cognitive impairment, that these people functioned better if in life they reported high levels of purpose. So neighborhoods, this is another big player when it comes to our health. And something that we're hearing a lot more about with COVID is how exposure to parks and nature is so helpful for our immune system. There's evidence that it increases natural killer cells. It also seems to not only fight off infection, but tumor growth. And not only that, but it boosts our mood. So there's some really interesting studies out of the UK showing that people who lived on streets with greenery had lower rates of antidepressant prescriptions. And this seemed to also be irrelevant of income in the areas or high crime. And not only that, but greening neighborhoods also seems to have a ripple effect in terms of reducing gun violence, which there's some interesting studies around that as we think about different public health ways to improve things. Now, this is something that could be a talk on its own, right, in terms of fairness. We know in the US, unfortunately, that somebody's zip code is a better predictor of their health than their genetic code. And there are obviously long-standing structural inequalities that need to be addressed and are directly impacting the health of Americans and people all over the world. So there's interesting international data showing that that more equitable societies are often healthier, and that there's also increased well-being associated with those. And well-being is not to be dismissed when it comes to our health. It turns out that well-being and optimism have a positive correlation with longer survival. And there's, for instance, a study done at Yale that showed that middle-aged and older adults who have a positive attitude about aging live on average almost 8 years longer than those who don't. And fostering optimism in that study, at least, showed that it was the same benefit as other well-known health benefits, such as maintaining normal blood pressure, exercising regularly, and not smoking. And this also brings us to another area that I wanted to mention. I'm just going to check the time real quick. Okay. And that's this environmental influence. So in the book, I sort of talk about how, back in the 1930s, there was this mystery of like, why are so many people getting lung cancer? And they couldn't quite piece it together. And at the time, cigarette smoke was ubiquitous, but it took a really long time for everybody to sort of piece together, in decades, in fact. And it was actually one of the people that first figured it out was actually a medical student. So it's just important to pay attention to those things that catch you and realize that you could develop it into something much bigger. So one of those things that's an environmental influence now that we need to be talking more about are adverse childhood experiences. And there's ample studies now that show that these ACEs impact our health in ways that we hadn't originally anticipated. It correlates with all kinds of things and health outcomes, including things like obesity and diabetes and other conditions that we typically had not attributed to any sort of relationship with childhood trauma. But here's the thing that's important to know about ACEs. So it turns out that studies show that practically every other person you pass on the street has a history, some sort of history of childhood trauma. And that's not the kind of thing that people go around talking about, but it's important to know because it contributes to how they are as adults. And the nice thing is, if we start to address it and start to be aware of it, particularly for the clinicians on the call, it's something that we can make a difference in. And there's so much work being done around how to address trauma, how to alleviate some of the repercussions of it. There are things to be done. So I want to mention that, and probably many of the people on the call are aware of it, but it's, since the time I was in medical school, this field has really blossomed. So let's talk about the ripple effect of kindness. So here's what I fully wish I'd understood when I was in medical school, and what I wish so many policymakers and people far outside the hospital would understand. And that's that our relationships and kindness in all the areas of our lives profoundly shape our physical and mental health. And now, those of you that were lucky enough to train at Rochester know this from the biopsychosocial model. And what's so reassuring is to know that it's so lovely how it dovetails with everything from the field of public health about the social determinants. And so that was really my goal, was to try to get this language out there so that more and more people could be talking about it, and we could start to address some of these real issues, because we know that kindness buffers stress, and the more buffers for negative stress we create as individuals and society, the healthier we are, even with diseases or pandemics that may come. We also know that there is a lot of pain out there. You just have to Google, "Why do I feel so?" and see what comes up. Why do I feel so lonely? Why do I feel so depressed, tired, etc.? And this isn't the kind of pain that's necessarily going to be fixed in a doctor's office or with medications, but it might be fixed through kinder societies and policies that help create a kinder, more supportive culture in all these different areas of our lives. And so what we're talking about here is actually the importance of creating a society that supports not only social health, but also mental health on a personal and structural level. So I just want to actually take a second and do a mental health checkup. So we know that in the US, about half of adults will experience a mental illness during their lifetime. We know that for people who do experience serious mental illness, that they lose nearly 3 decades of their life, potentially. Now, part of this is due to issues with medical care, and And then the other part has to do with a poorly understood relationship between the mind and body, and how actually they may be a similar, and I talk about this sort of in the book, it may be a similar process that's underlying a lot of the things that we're seeing. But nevertheless, it's important to know about. It's also important to know that depression is the leading cause of disability around the world, and it costs us over $1 trillion in lost productivity. And not only that, but with all of that, it turns out that only 1% of global aid in the last year went to mental health. Even though mental illness is considered a far greater threat to global health than heart disease, cancer, diabetes, or a number of other conditions. And I suspect that a large part of this has to do with the stigma that remains around mental health and talking about mental health. There was I don't know if we have any emergency physicians on the call, but there was just a report that was put out that it looked like about 3 out of every 4 physicians who work in the emergency room still feel stigmatized about talking about their own mental health needs and then seeking help for it as well, or in fear of retribution. So that's something we need to do some serious thinking about in terms of our own field. So it raises this question: how do we take better care of one another? Especially in medicine and all the different areas of our lives, it does feel as though it comes down to kindness towards ourselves and others, and also kindness in paying attention to the structures and systems around us and what we can do to make them stronger and fairer and more equitable for everyone. So here's the irony. I wanted to become a doctor to help people live healthy lives. And while it's a tremendous privilege to wear a white coat, I also know that healing goes far beyond the hospital. So here's my suggestions. Be kind to yourself. Be a supportive family member and friend. Be a supportive parent if you have children. Be a supportive coworker or boss. Be a teacher or a mentor, and I know many of the people on the call are. Be a volunteer. Be a thoughtful, involved citizen. And try to remember every day all that we have in common. I'm going to actually, I know I'm getting short on time, so I'm going to just go ahead and read this quote, and we can go ahead and stop there and talk about maybe some of the other things in the Q&A, but I'm just going to read this quote. This was written by a friend of mine, Marty Kornfeld, who's a lovely fellow. If we all do one random act of kindness daily, we might just set the world in the right direction. So I thought we would take that to heart. And I'm going to actually go ahead and stop at this point, and we can move on to the Q&A so that we're in good time, because I know that everyone's time is precious. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Harding. That was a really incredible presentation. And
thank you.
I'm just going to move on to the questions. We did get some questions that were sent in early, so I'll start with those as soon as I locate them, and then we can we'll also be monitoring the Q&A section, right, for any.
Oh, sure. Maybe just while you're doing that, while you're getting those together, I actually just want to say something. And this is sort of the ripple effect of kindness that's important to know. So there's actually all these really fascinating studies. And I saw we had some sociologists on the call too, that show we have a far greater impact on the people around us than we realize. These are sort of like one series of them that I particularly am fond of are the friend of the friend studies. So showing that things that happen to you affect, somebody who's a friend of a friend and their friend even too. And so, it ranges from everything from happiness levels to waistlines. I mean, it's actually quite remarkable. So just realize that there's great power in the things that you decide to do in your day. And it may feel small, but it actually creates this lovely ripple effect of good. And also that means that you don't have to be like the boss or leader to make a difference in your organization or in your life in any capacity. I know sometimes when I talk to students, they're like, we're waiting for the leadership to make some changes. And it's like, actually, we all get to contribute right now. So
thank you for that.
Sure.
The first question that was pre-submitted that I'm going to ask you, how do we find the balance between being kind, but also respected / assertive as a woman?
Oh, I'm so glad that this question came up. So actually, I am going to go ahead and share a slide because I think there's this misperception about kindness. And it's this idea that, kindness for many people, and I think particularly in the past among maybe some male leadership, there's been this feeling of that, kindness is sort of like being a pushover or showing weakness, but actually kindness takes incredible strength. And I think a big part of that is actually how do you navigate conflict in a way that, retains someone else's dignity, but still gets your needs heard. And what I found particularly exciting in this work is that conflict resolution. I don't know how many of you on the call had formal conflict resolution training. I know I didn't, but it's a thing and it's a skill set. Just like we learn like reading and math or languages in school, we could also learn conflict resolution skills. So if you like, I can show the slide that I didn't quite get to, but it addresses this point. Okay, let me just share my screen one more time if you guys don't mind. So I've labeled them here as 6 skills for humankind, but it's basically conflict resolution skills. And the sort of 101 of it is this idea of like forming connection first, creating safety with another human being. And that's kind of step 1. And if you don't have that, you have to sort of reassess the situation. There's also things like keeping your calm no matter what's going on, which is a tough skill. And the other big piece of this is that, kindness is a practice. It's not like they're kind people and unkind people. It's like we all have our moments. My kids love to remind me that I wrote a book about kindness. It's like, it's just something that we get to practice over and over throughout the day. And the other piece of it is compassion, which is a lifelong practice. And this is compassion both for yourself and for what someone else is experiencing. And it's this sense of, so the opposite, it relates to belonging. And what I found interesting, and probably some of our sociologists on the call could answer this too, is the opposite of belonging is actually othering. And you're seeing a lot of that right now. And it feels particularly relevant in this week right before we head into the election. And there's sort of, it's like our clever brains trick us into thinking that we're in this for ourselves, but there's ample evidence that we are in this together. We're certainly seeing that with the pandemic. And then other skills that all of these can be developed in our practice, but it's sort of this idea of sort of thinking big picture, trying to get at the larger purpose behind the problem that's directly in front of you, inspiring people to change hearts and minds. And this gets to our freedom to be able to change our minds. And then the hardest skill of all, which I think no matter where you stand politically, I think we're all going to have to address starting next week, is how do we reconcile and how do we move together so that we can solve our true challenges together? Let me stop the share. It's a lot, but I figured it would be something just to get people thinking about.
Yeah. Next question.
Thanks, Jess.
How do you find the balance between being kind? Oh, no, sorry. How do we espouse happiness without denying the pain suffered by many around us?
So that's also a great question. I think, and I suspect there are some psychiatrists on the call. One of the things, I think it really gets down to listening, right? Like hearing what's going on with other people and trying to understand what their experience is. And, as a psychiatrist, this is something that we do. And as doctors, we do a lot is, you can listen and try to understand someone else's experience without necessarily saying that you agree with it. And this is sort of the art of compassion. And actually, Dr. Schwartz has done so much work on burnout, sort of the differences between empathy and compassion. But that's actually a big part of it. So happiness is funny. So training in psychiatry, I was surprised how infrequently happiness sort of comes up as a topic, yet it's an entire field of study, in terms of positive psychology. And it was totally eye-opening to me. Like I went to this really wonderful event called the World Happiness Summit. And it was like all these leaders from positive psychology. I think I was one of the very few psychiatrists there that had trained in sort of the medical side of things. And it was interesting because it was sort of, it felt like the two halves of thinking about the human experience. And I think the thing is, you know, happiness, it's like the yin and yang, right? Like the happiness and sorrow go together, and we have to acknowledge both of them. I don't know, what's been your experience with that? Or Dr. Schwartz too, if you want to jump in, feel free.
I would definitely agree with what you're saying, Kelly. I think that in some ways it's hard to really feel the deepness of happiness without having also experienced some of the depths of sorrow.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge, at least for me in my career, was learning to walk with, but not to necessarily own someone's issues. And that I think it is an art form, and it takes time.
Absolutely. It does take time. And I just want to echo what you're saying, because I think and actually, Dr. Schwartz, you've been involved in this too, that this idea that sort of people who are more empathetic are at higher risk of burnout. And it seems as though sort of just sort of thinking about brain anatomy to some extent, you know, empathy is something that we develop at a very young age, that it's sort of like my toddler who would break down with his buddy who gets hurt, you know, all of a sudden they're both in tears. Whereas as we get older, our frontal cortex comes more online, and we're more able to process somebody else's experience, not as our own necessarily, and then go do help-seeking behavior for them. And I know one thing that I found particularly interesting, whether it's dealing with compassion or thinking about kindness, is the role of time. And you just said the word time, that we know that when people are more relaxed, less stressed, less under pressure, feel that they have more time, they're better able to engage those higher level, higher cortical functioning areas of their brain. And they're also able to be kinder. I had it in there, that Princeton study, which if people don't know about it, it's kind of this like old study that shows that even really kind-hearted people who are studying theology at Princeton University, if under pressure, and they're supposed to give a talk about the Good Samaritan parable, if they're under pressure, they don't even stop for somebody who's clearly in distress right in front of them necessarily. So, but they do if they have more time.
Okay. So another one of the pre-submitted questions that we had, in comparison to men, do you feel as though there is more of an expectation for women to demonstrate kindness in the field of medicine?
Actually, I'm going to throw this out to the chat. What do people think? Or even just in general, are women expected to be more kind? Because I don't necessarily have the right answer for this, but I'm curious. Yes. Yeah, I think there is this expectation. It actually reminds me of there are these studies that show that if a man, if a father participates in the PTA, he gets a career boost from doing that, whereas it's just sort of an expectation for women oftentimes. But you see that and play out in different forms. So, and actually, Dr. Schwartz, I'm curious, what's your thoughts on that? Because I know this is something you've also thought about.
You know, I think it has to do somewhat with epigenetics, or maybe what I used to call the way we were raised. And I think it is part, in general, I mean, certainly there are, with everything else, exceptions to the rule, but I think it's more a part of the fabric that women grow up with. The nurturing, kindness, be there for someone. And, you know, I just today watched a YouTube that was put out by Duke about their house cleaners in the hospital. And it just exuded such warmth to the people that they interacted with, and they actually had the time to do that interaction. And I feel sad that when I was a medical student, I had that time too, but I don't have the sense that medical students have that latitude these days, and they miss this kind of connection, which I think was foundational in how I went on to take care of folks.
Yeah, actually, I'm curious, Jess, what's your experience with that, or other med students who are on the call?
Sorry, to make sure I answer it correctly, could you clarify my experience with
Just having time.
Oh, time. Okay. No, I can't. I can't say that I have a lot of it. I think it gets better as the years go on. So I felt like I had a little bit more time second year than first year, and as a third year, I have more time now than I did as a second year. But it's interesting because I feel like, in terms of the topic that we're discussing, kindness, and something that we discussed previously the other day is, you know, how, when you're learning medicine, how do you incorporate learning kindness into learning medicine and learning about patients? And I feel like it's interesting because later on in your medical school years, you have more time, but you haven't necessarily incorporated that backbone or that understanding yet. And so it's a bit of a disconnect in terms of those two issues. And it really is upon you to individually seek out that information and that understanding at that point in time. And I'm not sure everyone has the resources to do that, or is even aware that that's something that would be worth their time, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, it requires a lot of thought, and it's this ongoing practice too. And it also gets at sort of like boundaries, like, and creating time for yourself. The other thing is, I would say, and probably many of the people on this call have experienced, is you know, how do you do that in a way and model it for other people? It may be modeling it for other people in your workplace, modeling it for people in your home, doing what you can to try to incorporate some of these kindness practices as much as possible. And with the understanding, of course, that we're all human and we're going to mess up from time to time. And that's just part of it. So
I was just going to add, first of all, a shout out to Mary Labinowski and actually Catherine Flannery, that are both on the phone, and they're my classmates. And Mary asked, does kindness take extra time? And it's a really good point. There's a perception, or maybe we hide behind the idea that being kind takes more time. But actually, I think what kindness takes is, you know, Valerie pointed this out, being a good listener, but also a certain amount of vulnerability that I think a lot of people feel a little reluctant. You know, it's like the old Dick Tracy, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. So.
yeah, no, it's a good point. And I think the other thing is, when people talk about kindness, it you know, sometimes they're sort of thinking these like grand gestures of kindness, but really sometimes it's like taking a second to like look someone in the eye and say like, hey, how are you? Or, you know, these little sort of micro kindnesses actually add up and make a difference. And it actually gets at helping us feel more connected to other people too, because we know that, you know, when it comes to things like loneliness, it's both the quality and quantity of your relationship. So even those like waving at somebody who's walking on the other side of the street, that makes a difference. And you don't know how many people that person's seeing in their life either. Yes, it's so true. Especially, you just have to smile at someone. And, you know, it was interesting. I just participated in a panel about loneliness and strategies to try to address it. And one of the things that struck me is that it's not just, you know, older adults, it's also people who are Jess's age too, who are sort of in this early 20s that, excuse me, that the data is showing that there's a lot of loneliness in that, particularly with the lockdowns right now.
Would you like to move on to the next question?
Sure.
Okay. So one more from the pre-submitted, and then I'll move on to the live Q&A. But this one is asking about ideas for ways to engage in kind acts virtually during the COVID-19 lockdown.
This would be something that, I mean, I think the biggest thing, and people are probably experiencing this too, is actually in some ways we're probably more connected. So for instance, I just want to give a shout out to some of my med school classmates that are on the call. I see Jen Weiss's name right there, and I heard Olivia's on, and Jennifer, and there's so many others. But we hadn't had a reunion in a long time, but we all connected virtually, thankfully, to Zoom, just as we're doing right now. And so that actually, I think, has been a gift, this sort of like reconnecting with people if we can't necessarily get together. The other thing is, I mean, it's pretty amazing with technology, how people who have access to technology, people who've been able to connect from all over the world, like to know that there are people on this call that have a connection to Rochester, but are all over. And I didn't ask where people are in the world, but I know from the attendee list, it's everywhere. And I know my aunt is on in Hawaii, so which is also just pretty amazing to think about. I think the other thing that is actually beneficial and is, I think particularly medicine, we do this, we sort of have like our professional face and our professional life and our private life. And the reality is we just have one life, and the two blend, and they're blending even more. Like, I'm surprised one of my kids hasn't come in during this conversation. We're seeing into people's homes now. We're seeing in this way that actually reminds me of home visits I did as a resident. You're getting to see with telemedicine now, like you're getting to see people in this much more whole way that I actually hope doesn't go away after the pandemic, because that's really, I don't know if Dr. Schwartz or Jess, if you're having that experience or if other people are too. It's actually quite interesting to see. So there are these sort of tech ways. And then of course the getting together is a different kind of story. So what have you, Jess, what have you seen, or Heidi, in terms of ways that people are finding new avenues for kindness given the limitations of COVID?
Something that I've seen is when you're having a meeting, particularly if it's non-class related, people will often show up with coffee or little snacks, almost as if it were a more intimate meeting. I think it's also interesting that the Zoom has so many different features on it that are kind of fun or funny, and so it may not be directed at any one person, but the fun backgrounds just to make things a little more lighthearted and jovial, just to make someone else laugh, even if it wasn't intended for a specific person, can often lighten the mood. And I've seen some pretty funny ones on here, so it's always really nice to see.
That is a good one. I just heard a fun game that they were playing called Escape the Zoom, kind of like Escape the Room, but now with Zoom, like different ways of doing it. Yeah, no, people have gotten so creative, and it's in this way you wouldn't necessarily anticipate, and thoughtful too, like the bringing of food, and even like the reaching out to neighbors who maybe aren't able to go to the store as readily, or things like that. Absolutely.
I've been sort of an advocate of telemedicine for quite a while and involved in several studies with this. And I'm a big believer in it because for exactly the reasons that you bring out, Kelly. There's an intimacy that happens when you see someone in their own environment. And many times they feel so grateful that we are willing to, make that effort to make the connection, and then because not only do we connect with them as someone who needs our help, but I look into the background and I say, wow, that's an interesting painting, or what is that over there? And then it creates that curiosity that also connects us as human beings.
Yeah.
So I find that it's been a very positive thing in many ways. The hard part is the social determinants of health, right? A lot of people don't have bandwidth to be able to have a good connection. Some people are embarrassed about, I'm not sure I really want you to see my house, kind of thing. But I think for me, it's really sort of enriched the kind of relationships that I had.
It's true. And actually, and I don't know if other people on this call have had this experience, but now it's pretty routine for like my faculty meetings or meetings with students. We start out with just sort of checking in now, like something we didn't do before, like whether it's like just going around and saying something that went well this week, or doing like more gratitude kind of exercises, or just checking in to see how people are doing. And it's nice. I feel like in some respects, um, those relationships have really deepened, which is an unexpected bonus. And I feel grateful for that happening.
Okay, I'm going to move on to some of the live Q&A questions.
Oh, sure.
This is how can we assist those around us to practice kindness?
I get asked this question a lot. so it's sort of, in my mind, it's a two-parter. The first is having some empathy, like why that person might not be acting so kindly. Actually, I think sometimes what's been helpful is, one, are they under pressure or time crunch? Two, just sort of thinking about the thing, as the people who work in mental health on this call know, and the doctors, it's like, you just never know what someone else is suffering with. Even somebody that you may see all the time, every day, you just don't necessarily know. And so when you see someone acting unkind, it's actually just good to take sort of like that mental moment to sort of check in and with yourself and say what's happening here. And it will also help you retain your chill, kind of, if you're under any sort of situation where people are verbally or feeling not as kind physically. So that's one piece of it. And then the other piece of it is, I think the other thing is modeling it is so important. And I have to say, I mean, when we talk about like clinician wellness, it's not enough to say like I model self-care. Like we need to also model like policies and practices that support that. And that means like thinking about things like breaks. Like I know, it was like before COVID, things like sort of, taking time, like 10 minutes on your break to go grab food or talk with a colleague, or to do like even meditation or something, we're sort of like seen as like too out there. Whereas now it's like it's actually starting to become more of the practice, because we realize there's a lot at stake, and how we feel and our emotions are actually really important for how we practice, and whatever field we're in, whether it's medicine or something else. So modeling it as much as possible, but also being mindful, if you have any foot in the policies of your workplace, your home, the neighborhoods we live in, all of it, start thinking about like, what can you do to make it so that, so that the choices to be kind are easier. I don't know if Jess or Heidi, if you have, Dr. Schwartz, if you have something to add to that too.
I would just strongly agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing too, right? Like we're entering this period, and I mean, I forget the number. It was like 80% of people are feeling super stressed out this week because of the election. And it's like, that's like a wave on top of a wave. Like, it's just like, there's been so much pressure for so many reasons. And then now with the election, no matter what the outcome is, people are feeling stressed out about it. And I think just sort of acknowledging that that's going on. And I also just want to say it might be good in this week before next week, sort of thinking about what are some strategies you can do to try to, no matter what your feelings are on the election, like just to build in some self-care and self-kindness into next week. Because I think the reality is it's actually probably easier to be kinder to other people than it is for ourselves. And I've found it's not sort of a research thing, but in general, I found often women tend to be more able to give kindness to others than to practice it for themselves. So that could be something like thinking about like a couple friends you want to connect with next week. It could be about getting like maybe a little extra sleep, because we know that just helps us navigate things, thinking about how we want to approach the news next week, like taking breaks. We talked about feeling busy all the time and connected, and we know social media has its pros and cons, but like taking breaks from some of these things sometimes are positive too. I don't know, Jess, if you've thought about this at all for next week, or Dr. Schwartz, like what you're seeing in terms of this, or ways to practice kindness towards yourself in our last couple minutes.
You know, I thanks to Trish Luck, who's also on this phone call, have become much more regular with my mindfulness and meditation. And I find that that is, and connecting with a community that shares the importance of being centered. You know, there's only so much we can control in life. Yeah. And there's also that whole concept of we are enough. And so I try to come back to that, and I, you know, engaging in certain conversations are actually, some of them are really counterproductive from my perspective, and so I pick and choose.
Yeah, no, these are all important points, and being mindful of that. And I'd say something too that's been a big part of this training is also just really paying attention to your emotions. So if you're not feeling good about a situation, like being mindful of that, and doing what you can to try to work around that. There was something, there's the work of BJ, I'm forgetting his last name. I think his last name is Fogg at Stanford, who's looked at sort of like some of these techniques in terms of like, how do we make things better for ourselves? And one of them wasn't just mindfulness, but this idea of sort of shine, like what are things that we do that we love? And it might just be like our own thing, like, you know, like dance into a piece of music we like, or doing something just to put us into a good mood. And it sort of like helps more difficult things go a little easier. And now, since most of us are at home or working from home, you have more opportunities for these kinds of things.
Okay, Dr. Harding, it's 7:13, so I'll leave it up to you on how many more questions you'd like me to read out, if any.
Actually, I think actually we need to end at 5:15. So there's, I think there's a wrap up, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have the schedule right in front of me. So but thank you so much, Jess.
Yeah, thank you.
So yes, and I just want to say thank you to Dr. Harding and to Jess Hubert for really leading such a lively discussion here. And I do want to just share my screen here for a second. And we'll go to the next slide. Again, thanks to everyone who's on the call tonight and in the Zoom, and to all your input. I know we didn't get to all the questions. One of the things that we anticipated was that we weren't going to be able to cover all the questions, so that we're hoping to use these forums, both Women in Medicine and the University of Rochester's Women's Network, in order to keep the dialogue going. And so that's the next plug, which is, if you haven't done so already, I'd really like to encourage you to join the Meliora Collective and to explore the Global Women's Network group and the Women in Medicine group. The Meliora Collective is an exchange, is an exclusive University of Rochester community of alumni, students, parents, and friends who want to make meaningful connections for personal and professional exploration and growth. And then once you join, members have the ability to network, become a mentor, and connect with students and alumni with similar interests and experience by joining a variety of other special interest groups. So I am just in the process myself of dipping my toe in there, and it's been a really wonderful collaboration. So with that, I would like to say thank you so much for your attentiveness, for your responses. I hope you have a great evening, and please stay safe.